One second. Hey, this is Andy Revkin. I am directing the new initiative for communication and sustainability at Columbia University's Earth Institute. And for the past month, I think this is actually like the 1 month anniversary of me doing this thing called Sustain What, which is what you're looking at right now. It's an ongoing conversation on pathways to resilience, better outcomes, lower losses amid this COVID-19 pandemic. And also really right now envisioning how to build a better world going forward, which considering that trillions of dollars are going to start to flow now is something we have to do in parallel. You got to think about the now and the next at the same time, or we could just rebuild the world we came from. And as Laurie, Garrett, and Jeff Goodell have shown, Laurie for decades, Jeff through a career that's focused on some of the big issues I've also zoomed in on for a long time, like climate change, has dived deep this recent month or so into this COVID-19 nightmare. And both have revelatory stories that came out in recent days. Laurie's in the New Republic. People can look at the links in the background on around the video stream here. That piece, Grim Reapers in the New Republic on Xi Jinping in China and Trump, and how they single-handedly, pretty much through various lapses and covert acts and acts of omission, have created a big chunk of the nightmare we face. And Jeff had a fantastic and sobering story on the president of the plague just out. So I thought it was worthwhile to get you here. I know you're both immensely overtaxed, but so partially I'm hoping we could start by you just taking a breath and pondering. First of all, tell us how you're doing. And then pondering, stepping back, like, where are we in the story? If it's a 12-chapter book, what chapter are we on? And then we can start to dive in a little bit on the specifics in your pieces. Laurie, you were on, you've been on here already with me in a video chat on this phenomenon we're immersed in twice. So maybe we'll start with Jeff, who's a newcomer to Sustain What. And Jeff, can you tell us, like me, you came at this with you've had a longer path looking at so many issues, climate change, a big one like me. How did you dive in? Where do you feel you're at right now?
Well, I feel like I'm personally kind of recovering from the exhaustion of writing that piece, which was a kind of very deep dive I had to do very quickly to write in a couple of weeks and get up to speed on all of this. I think, we're obviously at a kind of turning point in this story in the most literal sense of, what's Trump going to do about reopening and this whole struggle that's going on, with the governors. But, that's the sort of near term. My sense is that, this story is just beginning to play out, really. And there's a sense that this is somehow going to be kind of resolved in the near future. And of course, it's not going to be anything like that. We're going to be living with this for a long time. Laurie knows about this is better than I do, but the development of vaccines and things is going to take a long time. I think longer than people think. It's going to be tearing through the developing world. The economic ramifications and echoes of this are going to last for a long time. So I think this is just the sort of beginning of a sort of very, very big story that is just sort of beginning to play out right now.
And it goes from the most granular possible scale, like your supermarket, to these global flows that it still boggles my mind that sometime in the month of November, some viral particle jumped species in a way that in just a few months not only disrupted things, but it's transforming the world in a way that, as you both have written, and we all know, is we're not going back to something, right? We're in a new zone here. This is an age of pandemics.
Andy, don't forget, it was, as our president says, it was a brilliant, particle. It was a brilliant virus.
It had metric.
Yeah. It wasn't just any virus.
Perfect virus. Perfect virus. Jeff, just tell us briefly about where you are in the world and what's your literally like. How's this affected your day-to-day life?
Well, I mean, like everybody, I'm sitting here right now in Austin, Texas. Like everybody, I'm staying at home, not going out. For a writer, it's less disruptive than it is for a lot of people. I sort of sit at home and write anyway in my office, and so in that sense, it's I don't have to. It's not changing my commute or anything like that. It's disrupted my life in a bigger way in the sense of where I see my kids. My kids are kind of scattered around a little bit. It's hard to see them. I have a mother who's in a rehab center right now that I'm concerned about. I'm working on another book, and all of a sudden I had a lot of research planned this travel this spring and summer that I'm obviously not going to be able to do. So I'm rethinking all that. So, it's disrupted my life in the same way that it has everybody else's. And I'm, doing the best I can to stay safe and focused on things. And, it's one of the great things as a journalist is that, you can continue to do your work. And I felt very grateful that I had the chance at Rolling Stone to write this piece that, was my contribution to the sort of broader understanding of this.
And when in the reporting, there's some pretty remarkable details in there about incidents that we're all familiar with, like Trump's Mar-a-Lago virus fest and other things. But was there some reporting factoid or revelation that really struck you the strongest as sort of reflecting the bigger challenge here?
Well, I mean, for me, this was, usually when I report a big story, I go out in the world and literally report it, right? I'm a big believer in going out and going to the places where the story happens, meeting the people, that's a big part of how I've done my job. And I wasn't able to do that on this. So, it was a lot of it was putting together information, reading other sources, pieces like Laurie's work, other people's work, talking to people like Susan Rice and Ben Rhodes and John Kerry and others who had insight into how the sort of politics of all of this, come to understand how President Obama dealt with Ebola in Africa and contrasting that a little bit. So, there were no sort of big aha moments for me in this as a reporter. It felt to me like my job was to assemble a sort of larger narrative. A lot of the story was coming to us every day, new headlines, new this, new that. And I wanted to try to step back a little bit and tell the larger story of where we are so far. So that's what I tried to do. Yeah.
So Laurie, you bring to this essentially a unique set of experience and depth. I think the last session we had, which was focused on advising developing country journalists or people new to the beat, how to go at this. And you hauled out your books, your 800-page manifestos and tomes on pandemic risk. And here we are another week or two since the last time we spoke. Is this just playing out like, how sometimes a story plays out? At the New York Times, I did these reconstructs and TikToks where you realize there's a beat to every big story, 9/11, et cetera. Is this like beyond that, or does this feel still to you like you're kind of like watching this train go off the tracks that you knew it was going to go off the tracks years ago?
Well, first of all, I think you asked, are we in a 12-chapter book? Where are we? I think we're in the very first pages of the first chapter. This is going to be with us for years, and it's going to utterly transform the world as we know it. I think we're already beginning to see remarkable conversations going on among economists about, this proves to us we should have had a safety net. This proves to us we should allow for a more, I don't know if you would say socialized economy, but an economy that wasn't so heavily skewed with 1% of the global population controlling half of global wealth. I think the data before this all started, the data in 2019 was something along the lines of 60 families or households controlled almost half of the wealth of the planet. And so you're hearing for the first time very conservative economists saying, gee, maybe we were wrong about that, because look at how this, temporary shutdown is resulting in us heading off a cliff towards the Great Depression. And the new data from the IMF and World Bank that came out today, they're actually using the word depression.
Right.
They're very hesitantly saying recession, which somehow goes down a little easier. You say depression and people start gagging and freaking out,
Right.
as they should, because that's where we're headed. We're remolding the global economy. We're going to remold everything about supply chains, about distributed production, manufacturing styles, and so on. And we're already seeing, today on the stock market, Tesla soared over $730 per share. Some of us bought Tesla at $19 a share way back when. And why would they soar so? Because all of a sudden, this global reconstructing of the economy has led everybody to question oil and petrochemicals, not
Right.
because of climate change, but because look at the fragility of OPEC and the oil markets in this situation.
Right.
And I think if you just start going down the list of what is governance, how does the UN work? What do we think of the WHO? What about the great power struggle between China and the United States and the very flawed personalities behind this disaster, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump? And you begin to realize that there's absolutely no unaffected peace. So even if tomorrow a miracle happened, Johnson & Johnson today said, we will bring you a miracle. We'll have millions of doses of vaccine ready in April. Not this April, next April.
Right.
Even if we think that's true, which I find quite remarkable, but even if we think that's true, we will have to go through another full year of COVID slaughtering humanity and witnessed it completely devastating the Southern Hemisphere, slaughtering Africa, wreaking havoc through Brazil, Latin America, Central America, the Philippines, Indonesia, India, Pakistan. And by the time we get to a year from now, what will be left of our world? Who will be running it? What will be the nature of distributed economics and the nature of humanity? This is a time that's asking every single question we've ever dared to ask about our time in history. And the answers so far are really ugly. And, when I fear that once Americans think they can go back outside again, or they've come up with some mix of testing for antibodies, testing for PCR for live virus infection, some sort of compromise on civil liberties that allows your employer to test you and kick you out of the building if you test positive, and whatever that's going to all look like.
Yeah.
And we head into a late summer where everybody starts to go, man, we dodged that bullet. We're going to just sit back and watch carnage across the Southern Hemisphere. And I think all of the humanitarian structures that were put in place to deal with global health, to deal with HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, global poverty, all of these structures will collapse in the face of it. They won't even be close to capable of taking on that carnage. And so we will all sit back and be devastation voyeurs for a while, and then it'll come back to us again.
Yeah, just a week ago, let's see, where are we? The days just flow. I did a live session with a group of citizens in Bhopal, India, who had actually, they knew each other because they had organized a plastic trash reduction campaign. But as the lockdown in India was shutting down poor people's ability to get even the 100 rupees a day they get for sweeping a street or something, hunger was stalking the slums. And so they created they sort of just pulled together a WhatsApp-driven food dispensary. And just 2 days ago, there's the headlines out of Nairobi, out of Kibera, the big slum that I visited a few years ago, about food riots. Several colleagues at Columbia and I are scrambling to assemble a team and work on some strategies for better forecasting. There's this thing called FEWSnet, FEWS.net, which is a famine forecasting apparatus, but it doesn't really integrate things like when a food processing plant's employees can't go to work anymore. It's really mostly about drought and flood, and so we have to rethink even how we anticipate where there are going to be this whole new set of disruptors. The food system is going to be the next one of the big crunch points too.
Well, so, Andy, but here's the thing, to take it back to Jeff's fantastic piece in Rolling Stone and back to where we kind of both start on all of this, we're facing, a level of challenge that is World War II plus the Great Depression plus the Black Death all at once. And we have Donald Trump in the White House, Boris Johnson at 10 Downing Street, Xi Jinping running things in Beijing. It's almost like somebody wrote a script and said, what's the worst possible leadership we could possibly have in the world at this crisis moment? That's the gravest set of crises humanity has faced in certainly more than a century. How could we make it the worst script possible? That's where we are. What do you think, Jeff?
I was going to just ask Jeff.
Yeah, well, I basically agree with all those things that you're talking about, and I'm concerned. I guess I also have a couple of other things, which is a sort of kind of reality distortion field concern. I mean, this thing that Trump is doing of rewriting the story of what happened during this pandemic. We all know that he tells lies, and we all know that the whole Fox network spin machine and all of that kind of thing with total disregard for the facts. But to watch it happen in real time this way with such high consequences, right? This is not just about, an election. I mean, there is an election at stake here, of course, but this is about dead bodies. And this is about, the global chaos and catastrophe that you articulated, Laurie. And we're watching this thing happen in real time. And when I first started this piece, just like 3 weeks ago, I was talking with Ben Rhodes, the former national security advisor for Obama, and we were talking about this, and I was like, there's no way Trump's going to get away with this revising of history. And he was like, well, don't be so sure. He's got a lot of money. He's got obviously all the acolytes that follow him. He's got the Fox network. And it's just astonishing to me watching what is happening. The complete brashness of this revision of this story, and that it's kind of working in a way, and it's astonishing to me. It's just astonishing. And I'm been doing journalism for a very long time, and I've dealt with a lot of stuff. And this is just seeing this happen in real time is blows my mind, and what the consequences of that are when they're really, people talk about this, but when there is no fact or truth or no trust and no, even in a story like this, when things happen before our very eyes, we get, our heads spun around about them. That blows my mind. And the other thing, of course, that's on my mind in the near term of this is the election. How this will play out just in near term with the election, and to what degree, this is also obviously going to change the campaign dynamics and all that. But voter suppression, how it's is Trump going to try how's he going to try to manipulate the election on this? Because obviously, when we think about what the consequences of this pandemic will be in the long term that Laurie described, this election is vital, right? If Trump is reelected, that changes everything, right? So, that's sort of
what you describe about rewriting your narrative that Trump's doing in real time. Well, Xi Jinping's doing exactly the same thing. And so the other thing that's happening is you have the Chinese saying, this might have come out of an American lab. Maybe the Americans made this virus. And by the way, we were valiant. We were fabulous. There was no cover up. We were great. Mm-hmm. And now today we have Rick Scott in the Senate saying, maybe this came out of a Chinese lab. Maybe the Chinese made this, and we want a full-blown investigation to take down China. The danger of this, the two biggest powers in the world, the two largest militaries on ever existed in the history of humanity. And right now in the South China Sea, the Chinese are moving their fleet around, and our Pacific fleet, well, one ship is down completely because last I heard 500 of its sailors had COVID and one had died, and we fired the captain, right? And another ship just went down and is docked because they can't go in the waters anymore. They have COVID. Mm. And, you know, we don't even know what's going on with the submarines because that's all top secret. But boy, can you imagine a worse scenario than COVID on a submarine? So our whole Pacific fleet is weakened, and we have this war of words going between these two powerful leaders. It's so dangerous. You know, if you threw in, you know, two things that could happen this summer in the middle of all this COVID disaster as this pandemic unfolds, one would be an actual military confrontation of some sort between China and the United States, or North Korea blowing off, you know, hey, look at us. We meanwhile can make nuclear ballistic missile. And the other would be, you know, a natural disaster of some serious scale that stretches FEMA beyond all capacity to respond. You know, a Cat 5 earthquake, hurricane, or some other climate change induced natural event. And, you know, you put these things together and you could just see how fragile everything is going forward for the next few months. What are you trying to show us, Andy?
Well, this is just sort of making your point about the power of some of that propaganda. And when you get spin on top of spin, this is Lou Dobbs, you know, holding China accountable. It's all about, now they're talking about reparations. China should pay reparations for the cover-up and mishandling of the Wuhan virus. You know, there's blame all around, as your piece showed really powerfully. But if people are just going to get into this finger-pointing mode and reducing trust and raising the temperature right at the point when the world needs to be thinking more proactively, more collaboratively, then, as you say, you know, it's leading in exactly the opposite direction you would want.
Look, nothing goes forward if these two continue to attack each other. The world, you know, these two have such an outsized level of power and economic control that if Xi Jinping and Trump attack each other continuously rather than coming together and saying, all right, let bygones be bygones. We have to come up with a vaccine. We have to come up with a strategy to save the planet. If they continue to be nasty, egotistical boys throwing mud at each other, we're all screwed. I'm sorry, I stepped on you, Jeff.
Well, no, I'm interested in your thoughts about this. I mean, because this whole China blame thing is really interesting. It seems to me, I mean, in the larger sense of understanding the pandemic and understanding the risks of viruses, it of course matters where this came from and how this emerged and in the bigger picture. But in the sense of Trump's failure and what has happened in America, it doesn't really matter whether this emerged from the wet market or from the lab, right? I mean, it got out, right? Whatever it was, it doesn't change Trump's responsibility for what happened in the U.S. And it also, Xi Jinping's cover-up, it was serious, no question about it. But on the other hand, they did publish the genetic information of the virus in early January. It was known by Azar and others in the administration in early January that this was a coronavirus. I mean, the China cover-up doesn't in any way excuse the Trump administration from their complete failure to act on this. I mean, they knew how wherever it came from, and whatever the Chinese were doing or covering up or not, they knew enough in the early days of January to take action on this. Am I right? I mean,
absolutely. And look, if I knew, there with my resources in New York City, now the epicenter of the epicenter of the epicenter. Yeah. But if I knew in right around Christmas, in fact, on Christmas Day, I put aside a lot of the frivolities and dove in deep because I could see there was an outbreak in Wuhan that was huge, and that and having been in the SARS epidemic in 2003 in China and seeing how the Chinese government responded to SARS, which was the great cover-up before this cover-up, I knew this is much bigger than they're saying. Whatever information is there, it's much worse. Well, if I knew that, certainly the CIA knew that. Certainly the NSC knew that. Certainly they were telling that to the White House. They were relaying the messages up as you documented, as the New York Times documented, as I, in my modest way, documented. We've all run the story. You know,
Right.
we know the big lie. So, yeah, they're trying to deflect it all by saying, China lied, China lied, China lied. Well, yeah, where were you? You
Right.
knew it. You knew it.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's astonishing. Completely astonishing.
There was this other layer to this that I discussed on Friday with a couple of former national intelligence officials. It was Alice Hill, who had also done biodefense prep work, and Rod Schoonover, who was on the National Intelligence Council right through this period. Well, he quit last year over the climate dispute he had with Trump's folks. And Rod said something so interesting that I had two different pieces here on it. One, which was about what I've been calling the page 21 effect. He was one of the authors of the threat assessment a year ago. You know, there've been several in a row, right, that had pandemic.
Yeah.
And he said that the challenge is, as you get this funnel effect, that it seems to be an outsized discounting of these bigger risks when it gets, so it ends up on page 21. So it's like everyone could say, oh, we had it, that, you know, we were warning about it. Even now, you know, it's pretty easy actually as a reporter to document how many warnings got to whatever levels in an administration. But you have to then say, well, what were the failures that prevented decision-making from going forward? And Alice Hill talked about, and this precedes Trump, which is that we don't run exercises in this country. We do not actually fully test our system. We do not take these scenarios and turn them into action agendas and test them actively. So you actually know, oh, by the way, a bunch of our ventilators are not being, weren't being inspected, and they're not working. And if taking these big risks seriously enough that you're running those exercises, it's like California doing the Great Shakeout.
I know
California does the Great Shakeout, but
I buy that. I don't know if I really buy that.
I'd be curious to know. Yeah.
Because first of all, I've been through any number of these exercises.
Mm-hmm.
And for a while, I mean, the big complaint from the whole medical establishment during the Bush years, George W., was that they were endlessly in drills, that every darn hospital had to role play smallpox outbreak, role play anthrax after 2001. And I'll give you two examples that I was personally involved in. In 2005, right after it was clear there'd been a mutational event with the H5N1 virus, and it had passed through different species of birds in Lake Jinghua and was now capable of infecting birds that got out of the Asia flyway, went across Siberia and into Europe. And so all of a sudden, we had a much broader species range that this deadly virus that kills 60% of humans it infects, was threatening us. And and I was worried. I was watching it go up Vladivostok and over and thinking, okay, it's going to go over the Aleutian Islands and come down into Alaska, and we're going to be looking at H5N1 in Inuits in Alaska, right? So I went to the NSC, and I was in a one-on-one meeting, and I started laying it out with him with a map and explaining what had happened with the virus. And within 5 minutes, there were 10 guys in the room. Within about 20 minutes, there were 30, 40 guys in the room, men and women, not just guys. And everybody was like freaking out, and they went straight to the Oval Office. And within 3 or 4 weeks, the president had ordered a full-blown pandemic flu preparedness plan, which was the first really major pandemic preparedness plan any administration had done. And then similarly, in 2014, at the end of August of 2014, I had already thoroughly denounced WHO. I had been denouncing everybody for not taking the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea seriously. And I got a phone call asking, would you come to the Pentagon right after Labor Day. I think it was 2 days after Labor Day. Okay, in the interim, Tom Frieden, who was then running the CDC for the Obama administration, had come back from an inspection tour in Liberia with his hair on fire, saying, "This is massive. We need, a huge response. This is going to be billions of dollars we have to pour in here." So I went straight to the Pentagon after sitting in consultation with several different military folks that were hanging out with me at the Council on Foreign Relations then. And I said, here's what the military needs to do. Here's a master plan. Here's who you should deploy. Here are the different wings of the military that need to engage in which ways. And General Dempsey said, I'm off to the Oval Office. It went straight to the Oval Office. And before you know it, like within 48 hours, they announced deployment of troops to go to Liberia. And the terms were not exactly what I laid out, but they were close. And I'm not saying that to talk about me. I'm saying that to talk that government was ready to move.
Right.
And they took a threat assessment seriously. And it was like that. I mean, lightning speed. So that makes the Trump response look even worse.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine, Jeff. You talked to Ben and so on, and you and to Susan Rice. I mean, they must have just been freaking out off the record, just shaken talking about it. Because if that kind of threat assessment had come through the channels in either the George W. Bush or the Obama administration, that would have triggered alarms. They would have been all over it.
Well, Susan Rice said that to me. She said if we would have gotten, she was talking about some of that early information coming out of China, just about the fact there was a coronavirus and stuff. She said if we would have gotten that information, we would have been all over it. I mean, they were very aware of the risks and understood very well how quickly you had to move. And, that idea of, as you know better than anyone, but even someone like me who has not been deeply immersed in this, but followed it over the years, and then got immersed in it for this piece. The idea of early action being urgent and so important is like the basic fundamental thing to dealing with the pandemic. That's the number one thing. There's no question about that. And so this delay is just murderous, right? It's just evidence in itself right there in the failure of this administration and why it has blood on its hands in this pandemic.
So one thing I wanted to ask you both about was when Jay Rosen, I showed this a few minutes ago, Jay Rosen from NYU, who's been a bulldog critic of mainstream media and the way they've covered the White House, the daily ritual of the briefings and the like. He said, it's straight unvarnished language that we're facing the biggest propaganda push in modern history from now through November, and playing by the normal rules of White House correspondency is essentially enabling this process. And you've seen some media starting to change the way, what they will just
yesterday.
Yeah, what they'll play or not play. But he says this is. He says this is, he calls it a civic emergency, and that requires the media to go into a new mode. And I don't know if you've thought much about that. You're more feature writers, you're also both engaged in social media, so it's not like you just write these long epic pieces. But do you have a sense of, is there a special responsibility for the media to cover this in a different way now, given everything you've laid out?
Well, I'll take that. I watch these press briefings and I'm aghast. It's unbelievable. We're starting to see a little bit of, a little pushback now from a few people. And I know that, the White House has kept out a lot of the, if you're an aggressive reporter, you don't get into the briefing rooms and all that kind of thing. And I understand the need for access for these journalists to keep their jobs, but it's been pathetic. It really has been. And the way the networks have covered these briefings, just airing them, letting Trump run them as some kind of propaganda commercials. I totally agree with what Jay is saying, that this is a public emergency. Our standard operating procedures do have to change. We have to challenge the president on this. He is clearly running a propaganda, re-election campaign in the guise of a pandemic response. I mean, it's absolutely our jobs to call this out. It's not just our jobs to, stand in the back of the room and raise our hands and ask questions about statistics and things. There's a larger story happening here, that it's not just my responsibility and Laurie's responsibility and other people like us who have more freedom because we're allowed to write in publications that give us that freedom. But I mean, I think the mainstream media is failing hugely on this story, and we'll see if that changes. But
when you look back at historical examples, you look at John Barry's masterpiece about the Great Influenza. One of the things that he goes into in great detail is how the Sedition Act had passed related to World War I and bringing down Emma Goldman and all the anarchists and anti-war leadership in the United States. And because of the Sedition Act, the media was already cowed. They were already scared to death. And so along comes this great influenza, and there's clearly mistakes being made. Woodrow Wilson continues to send troops into the trenches that die in ships before they ever even get across the Atlantic of this horrible flu. And the reporters don't want to cover the story. They don't want to get too deep into it because of the Sedition Act. We have a long history of censorship in the middle of plagues. Certainly, you don't want to have been a Chinese reporter in Wuhan trying to tell the truth about what was going on there.
Or a doctor.
In fact, there are at least 2 prominent Chinese journalists who've never been heard from again. They started writing some critical stuff and boom, they're gone. Who knows what happened to them? Or for that matter, in Iran right now, or in take your pick. And we're going to see some really serious epidemics unfold in some countries in the near future that are really terrible in terms of their history with the press. In fact, Moscow right now is in the grips of what may end up being the next epicenter of this epidemic. And we'll see how many reporters end up being jailed trying to tell the truth. So that makes, I think, Jeff's point even more important, because if we can't do it right in America and take on the president and take on this leadership, we can't have any expectation that they can in Ethiopia or Nigeria or Russia or China or take your pick, Guatemala. You want to try telling the truth in Guatemala today? I mean, this is, we have a duty that goes beyond reporting for Americans. If we can't open the doors to some truth here, then we're letting down all our colleagues who live and work in much more dangerous places for media.
The question of where do we go from here with our coverage is still so challenging. You also get this phenomenon. Jay Rosen described this as well pretty effectively, that the president has mastered this. It used to be called the Gish Gallop, where you just spew stuff so voluminously. Steve Bannon used to talk about this. Just flood the zone with bullshit and just keep at it, and no one will catch up with you. And it's essentially, you see Trump, even in the course of a day, he's basically in a Gish Gallop with himself. And anyone who's doing the fact checking, the media kind of dutifully do this fact checking process, but there are communication science scholars who say that just actually can resonate and reverberate the falsehood and make it seem more legitimate because it's in people's faces. You're actually giving him more time by covering it as like he said something wrong. And I just sometimes wonder whether we're just basically screwed in that sense, at least in the journalistic frame, as having journalism as we know it be the solution, as opposed to looking at this landscape of communication tools we have and thinking in a hurry about how to use them in new ways to get, to get things moving toward sanity. I don't know. That's why I'm at Columbia doing this thing. It's an initiative on communication and sustainability, ? Like, how does this work? And I just do wonder, and we can talk about that in the context of climate change too. But I'm one of these people who's not trying to spin off of this COVID-19 and say, wow, what does this mean for climate change? I think we need to work on this problem right now. This is bigger in a fundamental way than climate, in the sense of nothing constructive can be done on climate change as long as we're in this mode of facing this level of disruption. I don't know.
Well, I hope that a lot of scientists are actually on the climate side logging what it means to have so few cars on the road, what's going on that affects the slowdown, we hope, of anthropogenically induced change of the climate. Because, boy, this experiment, the last time we had an experiment that could show us what the input of human beings was to the atmosphere was when Beijing shut down everything for the Olympics. And we had a two-week window with blue skies over Beijing, right? And everybody could say, wow, that's what it is. Oh, yeah. Well, right now you can all look out the window and say, oh, that's what it is. Right. Clean air. I forgot.
Yeah.
What it was.
Well,
So-
it'd be interesting. One can hope that those signals are things that are getting to people right now. Well, maybe I don't need to commute every day. Maybe I can still be productive. Maybe. Your
more important question about the role of journalism right now, I want to hand this off to Jeff and just say quickly that, I think the timing on this, of course, is abominable, because you go to any decent journalism site online, and right next to your story is a plea for donations. Right next to whatever you're reading is, by the way, as long as you're here, please send us some money. We're all starving.
Going broke, yeah.
And we're going broke. And there's only a handful of institutions that don't have that. And that's because Jeff Bezos is paying for everything, or because, Mike Bloomberg is paying for everything.
Right.
But even the Bloomberg sites now are asking you to donate money. And I think, I'm willing to cut a lot of slack to my fellow journalists when I realize how on the edge financially everybody is. That it's just the entire enterprise is on the edge. And, stories, I don't know about your experience, Jeff, but I wrote a cover story that, 15 years ago, I would have gotten at least 3 times as much money for. And at least. And that's just where it is now.
Yeah.
And so we're asking reporters to take a whole lot of crap and put their ass on the line, and they're not getting compensated in anything that close to the right level. And when I see that president taking out, a woman reporter in the front row and calling her things that come this close to going into actual gender insults that we would say, Me Too moment, right? When I see that and I see what she's taking, and I totally identify with her, and it just makes me want to explode. And I know that nobody in that room is getting compensated enough to put up with that crap. What do you think, Jeff?
Well, the issue of compensation for journalists is, it's always been, it's bad. It's worse than it's been, but at least in my experience, it's always been bad. But, that aside, I do think that this is a defining moment for journalism, because if Trump can essentially get away with rewriting history in real time with these consequences, then what can't someone get away with? I mean, what is the point of being a journalist? What is the point of journalism anymore? What are we doing? I mean, if you can just, say whatever you want, and then 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, re-say it again, and then all of the journalists will sort of parrot you and maybe run some cryon that says something about, this is, maybe not the truth or whatever, but airing it. I mean, I just don't understand the point of journalism if this revision that we're witnessing works. I think it's just, and I actually don't, and here's me being naive, I actually think that it will be a defining moment, in the sense that I think that we'll see some rising up against this in some way. I think that we're getting to the edge of even the sort of extended reality. I mean, Steve Jobs used to talk about reality distortion field. We're getting to the edge of that reality distortion field now, and I just think it's so absurd now and so consequential. And I just really hope that in some way journalists rise up. Everyone knows what's going on. Everyone knows the game that's being played here. And if it doesn't, I don't know. I don't know what we're doing.
Let me ask you
anymore.
What do you give the odds that the epidemic is used as an excuse to cancel the election in November?
I don't know about canceling, but I think, playing games and delaying. And I think absolutely he will try to do that. I think that I think that maybe even that's part of the strategy of opening the economy now, so that we get a resurgence, in the fall. The people with the conscience are saying, stay home. And then Trump is saying, oh, just, everybody go out, don't worry about it, go vote. Or, I do not put any level of kind of machinations on that past them. So, I'm sure that they will look for every advantage that the Republicans and the Trump administration will look for every advantage they possibly can on the election with this. I mean, look what happened in Wisconsin. I mean, it's unbelievable, right?
But it backfired on them.
Yeah, it did. Yeah. But people putting their lives on the line to stand, in line to vote, right?
So what's the story, like for the journalists out there who've been thrown into this beat, who are, in struggling newsrooms or, on radio and TV, and like in South Dakota, where they've just now realized they're a hotspot because their governor failed to heed the idea of slowing things down. What's the story right now that you feel could be a way to kickstart getting in a better direction? Is there a non-Washington story? Is there an approach that can turn things around a little bit? I'm not asking you right now to solve this morass that journalists face, but are there some steps they could take right now?
Jeff?
Well, I mean, this is such a big story and it's happening in so many ways. I do think that, as we've seen in other crises, whether it's World War II or Vietnam or other things, it's, I was saying before that it's a defining moment for a journalist, but it's also a great moment for a journalist to have a huge impact and to really capture this story in ways that, more mundane times of our history don't allow us. You think about all the great writing and journalism that kind of just out of Vietnam, right? And we had that same opportunity here as journalists to really, whether it's, in the trenches of the sort of guerrilla warfare that we saw in Vietnam, some equivalent of that in, the emergency rooms in communities who are suffering the personal hell that people are going through and chronicling that in a very intimate and psychological and dramatic way, or whether it's in, the Pentagon Papers kind of thing of really showing, like the Times has been doing here, evidence of what they knew and when they knew it, and really putting that together in a very, very damning way that, could have huge impact. And so, I think this is actually, despite the problems of pay and all these kinds of things, a great moment to be a journalist. I think this is what a journalist lives for. There are these kinds of moments. And, that's what I was thinking about when I was writing the Rolling Stone piece. It was like, okay, I have my shot here now. This is why I'm here. It's hard on my family. It's hard on me. It'd be much easier just to sit in back and have, a couple of beers and, but no, I don't want to do that. I want to stay up all night and I want to get this thing written because I feel like this is, if I'm not doing this now, why am I a journalist? What am I here for? And I think that more broadly, it's a great moment. And I think there'll be a million different ways of going at this. I don't think there's any one kind of part of it. There's just a very many ways of telling the story.
I think,
and it certainly is one. Sorry.
I was going to answer your question. I think the accountability journalism is very real, and that's what we've been doing. And I think all over the world, you're going to see reporters stepping up to the plate to demand accountability of their respective governments and to point out where things have failed. I think the other thing that we're seeing more and more of now is journalism that's focusing on the question of equity. Who's getting healthy? Yeah. Who's not?
Right. Who's great point. Yes.
Who's not? And as this becomes a global scale perusal, if you will, there's going to be some huge stories there that are going to go well beyond the COVID paradigm itself to whole legacies of corruption and the Panama Papers sort of scale of divulging who's really got wealth, where it's really gone, and what they're willing to see happen to their own population. I mean, in your comments, Jeff, I thought you came close to saying, I thought I heard in what you were saying, Trump's willing to have Americans die in order to get reelected.
Oh, I think so.
And he did at one moment say, well, it could have been 2 million, but I brought it down. Great success. It's only going to be 100,000 dead. That alone, should have had every American saying, whoa. But perhaps he feels confident it's not his 100,000. It's interesting. One of the conversations I had earlier today concerned the notion of compassion. So part of leadership, and one way in which journalists end up being sort of a conveyance of messaging, is when leaders demonstrate compassion towards those who are suffering in their constituency, in their population, and demonstrate some sense that through the leader's compassion should be a vehicle for the rest of society to show concern and caring for their fellow members, their fellow citizens, right? And we've never once seen even a hint of compassion out of Donald Trump. At one point, he made an offhanded comment about an old friend of his saying, he's in an ICU right now with COVID. And then he quickly said, but, he had some issues. He was kind of a big guy, as if, this friend of his justifiably had COVID because he was fat. Well, that gentleman died today that Trump was referring to. And if that doesn't draw some kind of statement of concern about pain and suffering, about death and loss out of him, then, you almost feel like it can't come from him unless it's his immediate family, unless, someone, even if his grandchildren got sick, you don't know if you'd hear from him. And I think that's something that opens up the floodgates for journalists to ask, what does it mean to have a leader who shows absolutely no compassion for the pain and suffering of the people?
It's been weird too with Congress, not in DC. I think there's this, there are huge stories in every congressional district for someone to pursue, in the sense that, this is, as we all know, this is not just about the president. The Republican Party, whether it was the impeachment or in so many other ways, has never really staked a claim that you could really point to for the sake of their constituents. And here, if we don't see the constituent issues rising to the point of crisis, especially in places that, this is I've been wondering about the map of like Republican enclaves and where you might end up seeing the biggest impacts. You could see different ways to look at that, but those seem like pretty urgent now stories to tell that aren't necessarily focused on Trump, because it looks like he won't be removed from office before November at the very least, and he'll still be in office through January. So there's a lot of decision making to happen between now and then.
Look at every nursing home.
Oh yeah, I know.
We're now up to the majority of all nursing homes in the United States have COVID cases, and the dead bodies pouring out, with the families unable, not allowed to be there for them, helplessly watching as their loved ones perish. Look at the VA. And look at it going through the VA, look at it going through the jails. We're going to see every institutionalized context where people co-house affected. And, this summer the kids won't go to summer camp, but there will be contexts with children co-house that we'll see this virus go raging through. Each one of those is a story. It's a story of corruption. It's a story of failure to protect. Every single nursing home in America should have been subjected to COVID testing back in February. Right. And none of it was done.
Before we wrap, I wanted to run a couple of more concrete sort of scenarios by both of you, and I really appreciate your time, given how much is going on.
By the way, I'm hearing
Sirens.
Sirens right now in my neighborhood. So
yeah,
ambulances, of course.
I mean, right now the story, meaning like I've been in the New York Times front page room, in the afternoon when they're saying, "What's the story today?" And the story today is recovery. Big chunk of the country is now these two sectors, the East and the West, are figuring out ways to do the transition from like the hammer to the dance, meaning to track and monitor and isolate. That could lead to a very simplistic outcome, even without Trump talking about Easter bunnies like he did a few weeks ago, where you could. I don't know how this. How do you shape a story that gets into that without giving people the false sense of security? This is the complexities of this are really tough. Laurie, this gets to what you were saying a few weeks ago when you talked about the decisions you make in covering an epidemic are so much tougher than even war correspondence, because it's like framing, what's the headline on a story about recovery or transition?
It's about lives at stake with accuracy. That's the problem.
Right.
Today, a team from Harvard University published, I think, a very, very, very important and frightening paper looking at what reopening will be like and projecting out to the year 2025, laying out different statistical models for if you open in this way, that's your outcome. You open in this way, this is your outcome. And any way you look at it, it's resurging outbreaks, dead bodies. It's a nightmare. There's no easy future that we can look at. And how you write that story, how you tell just tomorrow's daily's piece about this study out of Harvard says, by 2025, right, X will be the dead body count. However you write that has implications for how governors are thinking, how mayors are thinking, and certainly panic level. And I have for years faced people calling me, Debbie Downer, a sensationalist, a fearmonger, blah, 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 blah. And now, I don't know how anybody could be accused of being a fearmonger, because all we have around us is fearfulness. We now live in a permanent post 9/11 world. This is what it felt like to be living where I am, directly across from the World Trade Center, on 9/11 and 9/12, except that it ain't just 9/11 and 9/12, it's years.
Yeah, it's interesting you compared it, because I was in New York for 9/11, covered it also, and it was obviously a huge thing, traumatic. The human suffering, and there was a lot of parallels, but it's also very different, right? I mean, it was an event. It happened. It had political and global ramifications, of course, but it didn't have this horizon that what we're dealing with now has. And so it feels different also. This feels much bigger in its, as you were saying in your remarks, Laurie, about this sort of scale of how this is going to be rolling out and echoing through our political system and our economic system. I wanted to say one other thing about how we're covering this that I think gets overlooked, and Laurie does a good job of this, but it is not talked about enough, is the importance of science journalism, of writers who can really understand the science of what's happening here, understanding models, what the models mean, what this virus, there's still so much we don't know about it, about its contagiousness, about, possibility for mutations, I think there's a great moment for science journalism here also. And this question of what does science, listening to scientists, what were scientists saying? And those are the parallels with climate change very clearly, right? I mean, it's like scientists have been explaining the risks, the consequences of burning carbon for 40 years, and we've ignored it, and this is why we're at a climate crisis. And there's a lot of parallels, of course, with that, with this pandemic. But I also think that in thinking about the future and shaping this, there's great opportunities for science literate journalists to articulate things here that really need to be written about.
Just the other day, I was on the phone with a science writing colleague of mine, and we've both covered HIV as it unfolded and been in the trenches on it for years. And we were laughing about Republicans starting an anti-Tony Fauci campaign, because I've known Tony since 1980. And my friend John, who was on the phone talking with me, has known him since I think 82, 83. And we've seen him weather every storm. And we were laughing, saying, just let them try to take Tony on. They don't realize what they're up against. He's the toughest son of a bitch there ever was. Grew up as a street scrapping, Flatbush Avenue, Brooklyn kid. And believe me, he knows where every skeleton is in every closet in Capitol Hill. And he knows how to play them.
But here's the question too. Should he stay or should he go? Is there a point for Tony Fauci when he says screw it, or is he still more valuable in this morass of administration?
That's a great question.
Out?
Well, it's only worth it if Birx goes with him. But if she stays as an apologist, then his leaving is muted.
That's interesting.
Right.
And Robert Redfield is showing his true colors, so we don't have to worry that we're going to discover one day that the CDC is run by a heroic, science-based individual prepared to stand up against the president. That's not in the cards.
So for news consumers out there, as opposed to advice for journalists, I did post here, there are some tools that are emerging. I used to write about some of these when I was doing my .earth blog at the Times, in this context of the climate denial and climate realism. There's a website called thefactual.com. I don't know if you've seen it. It basically creates a kind of a credibility scale for news. It sifts things in ways that seem pretty useful. Obviously, every algorithm can be hacked, and Facebook was trying to do this too. But are there practices that you would recommend for news consumers to avoid getting taken down the wrong road here?
Well, if Trump endorses it,
yeah, exactly.
I mean, he said hydroxychloroquine, and then he said, and I would personally think I might take it, he said. And now we can see a sudden spike in cardiovascular failure among people taking hydroxychloroquine. It's not a harmless drug, and those of us who have taken it for malaria will tell you it's an awful drug. And we're just hearing today, I think Rita Wilson was saying that when they put her on it, when she and Tom Hanks got COVID in Australia, that she couldn't walk for 3 days and felt horribly sick and thought it was all the drug doing it to her. So, but I would say generally, not just healthy skepticism, but on everything that's about medicine and claiming cures, claiming quick solutions, claiming vaccines around the corner, this is around the corner, blah, blah, blah. Take that with a very heavy dose of skepticism and assume that there are obvious financial motivations for overstating the likelihood of an immediate solution one way or another coming from a form of technology. When you hear that Google and Apple are going to team up on a way of monitoring who has the virus and some easy, quick way that you can know that the person sitting next to you on the subway is sick, I think you should take that with a heavy dose of skepticism.
Yeah.
When they rolled that in China, you know what the Chinese did? Everybody who had that app on their phones, when they would plug in to know, is there somebody next to me with a high temperature? If you, in fact, said, yes, the guy coughing next to you has the disease, when you got off the train, there were the police to arrest you and take you off to quarantine if you had your location locator on your phone. And so I would just say that everybody should follow the news very, very, very carefully and think carefully about, I think most news consumers ask, how does this affect me, my children, my spouse, the people I love? Use that barometer now and ask, really, if it were down to it at this moment, my husband has COVID and they're taking him off to the ICU. What is my thought tree to go through to say, yes or no on the treatment options? What have I read that I trust? And why do I trust it? If it's really about life and death, why do I trust it? Okay, so now that's the immediate circumstance of my loved one is sick. Now take it to the larger circumstance of I'm in the Navajo Nation. I just happened to have watched a video about COVID slamming the Navajo Nation, 45% unemployment rate, and massive deaths going on among the Navajo. In fact, more Navajo have died than the whole rest of the state of New Mexico combined. If I'm on the Navajo Nation right now, trying to figure out what should I agitate for? What political things could make a difference in our survival? What social activities can make a difference in our survival? Where do I turn for information that really answers those questions? Who do I trust? And why do I trust them? Is it, a religious source? Is it a scientific source? Is it a political source? Is it a certain political party? These filters have to be really carefully understood. You have to really ask yourself, because this is an existential moment. And if all you ever do is go to Fox or go to MSNBC, and one of those two dictates all your behavior thereafter and how you siphon all the news, then I think you're in big trouble.
Laurie, you brought up a really important point in a Lancet commentary you wrote. God, it must be almost a month ago now.
Ancient history.
I know, but it was on the profound underinvestment that agencies and governments make in social media, in communication as a fundamental component of public health. And something I wrote about years ago, we still have not figured out how to integrate this thing called public health into our calculations and our investments as a society.
Yeah.
A decade ago, I was at a meeting with Howard Koh at HHS. We were on a panel and we were talking about this, and he said, well, you go to a hearing on whether it's on sooty air pollution from coal-fired power plants, and you're enumerating the 20,000 deaths a year that come from that, and some congressman will always say, well, show me the bodies, because it's kind of a statistical thing. Public health is statistical. It's not like a person dropping dead of X in front of you for a particular reason.
You see a mass grave on Hart Island.
Oh yeah. By the way, I found it a little ironic. Do you remember a month ago, the Washington Post had this investigative, clever use of satellite photos showing Iran digging mass graves? Look at them, look at them. And here we are right in New York City doing the same thing. I think I was going to tweet about the irony there, but I didn't. The
Iranians beat you to it. It's been all over in Farsi. They've tweeted.
There you go. See, Jeff, on this question of what are some of the traps the media can avoid, there are things. We have this, the news people especially. I was a newspaper for 15 years on staff, and then 6 more as a blogger, and it's all about the now, and it's about the new study, like the Harvard study, and you get your headline, and you kind of feel like you've gone home, and some part of you knows, well, it's an initial study. These journals are doing fast turnaround papers, and so how do you flag that to readers? I don't know whether it's that or whether, whether it's climate or COVID, what are the parts of it that are a political question, and what are the parts of it that are really fundamentally more about the things, as you were articulating earlier, that we just don't know? This is a profound mystery, even as we're trying to say what to do. A lot of that what to do part is what to do in the face of deep uncertainty too. So it's like some of it goes deeper than politics. By the way, everything about right now in the United States is related to politics in terms of, but the bigger questions here are pretty transcendent. And is there something, some trick, some last thought about for readers or the writers, how we might get this a little less bad?
Well, I wish there were a trick. First of all, everyone has the media is so complicated now, right? I mean, there is so many ways of bloggers and people who are just basically tweeting, and then people writing books, people writing magazine stories. I mean, there's just TV. I mean, it's just very hard to generalize in any way. I think, though, that this is a moment where this is a sort of snake oil moment, I think. And there's just a lot of bullshit being thrown out there in lots of dimensions, whether it's, fake medical information, bullshit political information, bullshit facts. I think that this is the sort of bullshit detector moment for a journalist. I mean, I think that that's what our job is now very broadly. And I think trusting experts, and understanding who experts are and trusting them, going to good sources, understanding your sources, understanding who knows what they're talking about and who doesn't know what they're talking about. These fundamental things are really important in a really fast-moving story like this, where you're jumping in, maybe you don't know the nuances of this complex science. The politics of this are moving fast. I just think that it's a moment to be, as a journalist, to be bold, but also to be certain in who you're trusting, and that I can just smell the bullshit emanating up all over the fields here right now, and I think that's
you're in Texas, so
yeah. So that's what your job is as a journalist, is to figure that out and to give context and meaning to all this, and not just data, right?
And to do that for readers who are flooded with this nonstop stream of attract and distract and aggravate kind of flagging on social media. I think there are some. I'm going to just show folks one thing that I've showed here before. I think it's okay to write about a new study, and I think we should come up with labels. This is a label I started using on climate science. Caution, single study syndrome. In other words, there's a new paper. You're going to hear a lot about it, but don't ever assume that any one paper is like the grand thing. Maybe it'll end up being it, but don't. If we can think of ways to,
but we have to. We're way beyond that at this point, because one of the things that's happened with this outbreak is that scientists are now publishing before peer review.
Yeah.
So we're seeing papers that literally they wrote last night. They crunched the data last night. They all shared via email drafts, and somebody posted it this morning. And so as people with science backgrounds, we're compelled to have to go through the raw methodology, the missing control group, and decide, is this data that we can trust or not? And some of us are working too fast one day, and maybe we get caught in on something that actually was crap. Or we are in a cranky mood and we go through something and say, that's not worth paying attention to, and it turns out to be a really important study. It's really hard. The burden on, thanks, Jeff, for the shout out to science writers, but the burden on us right now is incredible, because I have a few scientists that I trust a great deal, who if I'm confused about a paper, I'm not quite sure what they've nailed or not nailed, I will run it past them and ask, what's your read on this? And sometimes they come back with insights that I would never in a million years would it have popped in my brain. And it's really helpful.
Yeah, I did the same thing. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask each of you to just give one last round of advice. And one thing I do want to say is, every day when I do one of these, I try to step back and honor the frontline workers all around us who are making normal life possible to some extent for those of us who are lucky enough not to be stocking store shelves, or not to be an orderly or a janitor sweeping a floor in a hospital that's full of people who are ill or dying, and the people taking care of our loved ones who are in nursing homes or in hospitals, the people we know as friends and neighbors who are in those situations, and the ones whose families have suffered these shocks in the last few weeks. This is, I remember back in January, someone, maybe it was you, Laurie, said the 1918 flu was the thing where everyone knew someone who died within a direct circle. 1 in 100, 2 in 100, right? 2%. And so this affects everything around us. And so just a moment to honor the people who are working so hard to sustain functionality. And you're going to, as we said at the very beginning, the food system is going to be a weak link going forward. We have to think about that a lot. And I thank you both for spending time here today. And again, maybe we can check back when there's another quiet moment, which see. On Thursday, I'm doing a session on this hammer to dance concept. Howard Frumpkin will be on. Thomas Puea, the guy who wrote this piece on Medium about the hammer and the dance, that got tens of millions of views and seemed to get that out there. There's a virologist from Colombia who will be on Thursday as well. And next week, on and on we go. I'm going to read a little bit of boilerplate. Sustain What is a global online video conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. And right now we're in the middle of hitting a big wall. Our prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment, the One Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. This webcast is produced by my new project, Columbia University Earth Institute's Initiative on Communication and Sustainability, which is an experiment in itself. For the time being, these sessions will be focused on mitigating the unfolding societal disruption and devastation driven by the global spread of COVID-19, this illness. But we will dip into other subjects and solutions when the time is right. And again, thank you both for being part of this. Laurie for being a three-parter, and good luck, stay safe going forward, and keep doing the good work you're doing. It's hard, and it's never been more essential. Thank you both.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
And